Welcome to Onlyfacts. Today we're unraveling one of history's most provocative accounts, Marco Polo's depiction of the Sentinelese tribe as violent and allegedly cannibalistic. Imagine stepping onto an uncharted island, only to be met with fierce resistance and tales of cannibalism. Were Polo's descriptions accurate or merely sensationalized stories of the unknown? Join us as we delve into the mysterious world of the Sentinelese, examining Polo's writings' vast historical context and the enduring legacy of one of the most isolated tribes on Earth. Buckle up, because this journey is as thrilling as it is enlightening. To understand this, let's first delve into the life of Marco Polo. Born in the 13th century, Polo was a Venetian explorer whose extensive travels through Asia were documented in his renowned book, The Travels of Marco Polo. Written in the late 1200s, this work introduced Europeans to the cultures, people, and places of the East, many of which were previously unknown to them. During an era when myths and rumors often filled the gaps of uncharted territories, Polo's writings captured the imagination of his readers. Among his many descriptions, Polo wrote about the Sentinelese, an indigenous tribe from the Andaman Islands, portraying them as violent and allegedly cannibalistic. But how much of this was true, and how much was a reflection of the times? It's important to remember that Marco Polo's knowledge was limited, often based on second-hand accounts and influenced by the myths of his time. He seldom had direct contact with many of the peoples he described, relying instead on stories from traders and other travelers. This lack of first-hand experience, combined with the era's tendency to sensationalize the unknown, likely colored his depiction of the Sentinelese. These accounts were often embellished to intrigue and captivate his audience back home, who had little knowledge of distant lands and were eager for thrilling tales. John Ritchie, 1771. John Ritchie, an officer with the East India Company, made one of the earliest documented visits to the Andaman Islands, though not directly to North Sentinel Island. He described the indigenous peoples as hostile and unfriendly, but did not specifically mention cannibalism. Maurice Vidal Portman, 1867 to 1888. Portman, a British colonial administrator, conducted extensive explorations of the Andaman Islands, including North Sentinel Island. His accounts focused on the Sentinelese's isolation and hostility toward outsiders. Portman documented attempts to contact and pacify the tribe, but there were no mentions of cannibalism. Indian government, 1956 onwards. Since India gained independence, the Indian government has adopted a policy of minimal interference with the Sentinelese. Official reports emphasize the tribe's desire to remain isolated and their hostile reception of outsiders. No claims of cannibalism have been made in modern times by Indian authorities or researchers. T.N. Pandit, 1967-1991, anthropologist. T.N. Pandit led several expeditions to North Sentinel Island. His accounts describe the Sentinelese as wary and defensive, but make no mention of cannibalistic behavior. Pandit emphasized the importance of respecting their isolation. These differing accounts highlight a shift in perspective over time. While early explorers like Marco Polo may have sensationalized or misunderstood the Sentinelese, later and more direct observations paint a picture of a reclusive and protective community with no evidence of cannibalistic practices. This contrast underscores the importance of cautious interpretation of historical accounts, especially when they come from second-hand or exaggerated sources. All lines of evidence, cultural, historical, linguistic, and genetic, support the conclusion that the Andaman Islanders have been isolated for a substantial period of time. As per an Indian government policy document shared by the country's Press Information Bureau, as a result of lack of contact, census taking on the Sentinelese has relied primarily on photographing of the island from a distance. Hence, it has been estimated that the North Sentinel Island specifically is inhabited by roughly 50 to 100 individuals. Surveys of this island have not found any evidence of agriculture. Instead, the community seems to follow the lifestyle of hunter-gatherers. They attain their food through fishing, hunting, and collecting wild plants, and restrict themselves to life on their indigenous lands of the island. The Sentinelese are for all intents and purposes still in isolation and rely on highly primitive practices for sustenance. The Indian government has sought to preserve the Sentinelese way of life essentially by respecting the tribe through the adoption of an eyes-on and hands-off approach. To this day, the tribe remains a pre-Neolithic Negrito tribe, which lives in complete isolation from the rest of civilization. In fact, it wasn't until 1991 that researchers first got in touch with them. This was done by a group of anthropologists from India. In India, in order to provide special legal protection to tribes, such as the Sentinelese in this case, primitive groups are listed under a status known as the Particularly Vulnerable Tribal Groups, PVTGs. This ascertains their protection under the Andaman and Nicobar Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Regulation of 1956. The specified policy declares traditional areas occupied by the tribes as reserves and prohibits entry of any and all non-members, except when due authorization is granted. Photographing or filming of tribal members has likewise been proclaimed illegal. The entire North Sentinel Island, along with the 5-kilometer coastal sea, has been declared a tribal reserve, and a protocol designating circumnavigation of the North Sentinel Island has been drafted.